And we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Schumacher, and welcome to episode 2 for week 2 of Bible Geeks. So, this week is on the definition of a covenant and then the covenant with Abraham. And this week I decided to split the videos up into two. And so, this one is going to be specifically then on the covenant with Abraham. So, we're going to start in Genesis 12 and go through the importance of that covenant. Where does this one fit in? Now that we've gone into a definition of a covenant, we've looked at the background. We've looked at the elements of a covenant. Let's apply that in the case of the covenant with Abraham. So you're going to see the covenant with Abraham. You're going to see that three main places: Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17. Those are going to be your three spots. Genesis 12 is going to contain the promises. Genesis 15 is going to contain the promises and the ratification ritual. And then Genesis 17 is going to contain, again, the promises once more, and then the sign of the covenant, which is circumcision. So we're going to start with Genesis 12. And for those who may be wondering, I'm recording on a different day, and yet the cat is back. So anyway, Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. So the Lord said to Abram, "Go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So here's the speech of the Lord given to Abram at this point in time. So let's do what we said we should do in the guidelines for interpretation video. Let's see, where does this literary unit begin? Where does the story begin? So for this one, remember what we said. I believe it was in the week 1 video on the pre-Abrahamic history video. So there's this Toledot structure. And if I didn't mention it, I'll just go over it really quick. So Genesis, the book of Genesis, has this marker throughout 11 times. It's this structure. Toledot is the Hebrew word. These are the generations of. And then it gives you who the generations, or the family record, so to speak, are. So if I actually just look here, I didn't have this pulled up, but so when I said it's repeated 11 times, so it appears in 2:4, so these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. 5:1, this is the generations of Adam. Then you have Noah in 6:9. You have the sons of Noah in 10:1. Shem in 11:10. And that was pretty short because then you get to Terah in 11:27. And then that one extends through 25:11. Genesis 25:11 is the death of Abraham. 25:12 is Ishmael, and that one only lasts through verse 18. 25:19 is Isaac. 36:1 through 8 is Esau, who is in Edom. 36:9 through 37:1 is Esau, the father of Edom. And then 37:2 Jacob. So those are the markers, and those are the sections in Genesis that kind of outline the story, and they tell you who the generations are of. So those being the markers for the structure of the book of Genesis, we want to look at the antecedent, the one before, the Toledot before this one. So where do we find that? It's actually not that far away. These are the generations of Terah. And so it says these are the generations of Terah, who fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans during his father Terah's lifetime. Abram and Nahor took wives. Abram's wife was named Sarai. Nahor's wife was named Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. And then 11:30, and this is important here. So Sarai, so we're talking about Abram's wife, was unable to conceive. She did not have a child. And then Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife. And then they set out together from Ur the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So they were going to Canaan, they came to Haran, they settled there, and then Terah died 205 years in Haran. Okay, so one of the just questions one might ask is, so why are these the generations of Terah and not Abraham? Abraham seems like an important guy. You've got Isaac, you've got Jacob. When they talk about the fathers, they don't go Terah, Isaac, and Jacob. They say Abraham. And I think here the reason why the entire ensuing drama here is about how Abram gets a son, his transformation from Abram into Abraham, the offspring that comes with that, and the revelation of God that comes with the whole story of where Abraham's offspring comes from. And so there's no spoilers going on right now. If it said these are the generations of Abraham and it started giving all those people off, first of all, it's going to give you Isaac, it's going to give you Ishmael, it's going to give you Jacob. Even though, well, Jacob was one of Isaac's, but you have the whole drama that's being set up here, the whole revelation, the whole point of chapter 12 through chapter 25, all the way through the aborted sacrifice of Isaac. Like, that would kind of be spoiled. And so, this is, we're not trying to jump the gun here. The point is to set up the Abraham story, not necessarily to say that Abraham isn't important in the lineage. So the generations recorded continue the line from earlier in chapter 11. So up through chapter 11, you're going back through, the generations of Shem, that gets you to Terah, and then that extends through Abraham. But it's setting the scene for God's covenant and his miraculous work. And then a little bit of background. So what other kinds of background might we pull in here? Well, there's a lot you can do with Abraham. It's mentioned all over the place. There's one that I want to highlight, though, that I think I want us to read the story of Abraham here against this backdrop. And so there's commentary on this section in Joshua 24. So Joshua's giving a speech to the nation of Israel. Remember, Moses did that at the end of Deuteronomy. Moses turned over, command of the Israelites, so to speak, to Joshua. Now this is the end of the book of Joshua. He's giving them the story of Israel again. And so in Joshua 24, we get a little nugget that's interesting here that I think is good context to keep in mind reading the story of Abraham. So this is verses 2 and 3. There's a lot I could have pulled in here, but we'll just focus on this part. So Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the region beyond the Euphrates River, led him throughout the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants." So the question I have is, what phrase sticks out as, maybe a little weird? I think it's this whole worshiping other gods thing. You think of Abraham, he's the father, he is the patriarch, he's the one to whom the promises were given. And I'll admit, I often thought of Abraham as, I guess I didn't even think about his religious background. I was just like, well, yeah, he's met by God, and I'd had this assumption without even thinking about it that, well, of course he knows who this God is. After all, Abraham, he's a pious guy, we all like him, certainly wouldn't have been worshiping all those other gods. But no, that's not necessarily what the text says. The text is basically telling us that Abraham grew up in a household where other gods were being worshipped. The text makes no comment that even though all those around him were these silly pagans who worshipped all these other gods, Abraham, though, from his youth, he knew Yahweh was the one true God. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say anything either way. I think what we can conclude here is that Abraham was brought up in this environment that wasn't monotheistic, was not Yahwistic, at least from what we can tell. This whole revelation that's going to come from Abraham's perspective is coming from one of the gods. We don't really even know if his family worshiped Yahweh among other gods or if they didn't even know who Yahweh was. The text does not say. So let's read the story against this backdrop. Let's imagine Abram is being met by, as far as he knows, one of the gods. He may have known Yahweh. There may have been worship given to Yahweh. He may not have. But that's the context that Abram has in his household. And we can take that from this. His family worshipped other gods. That was the family he was born into. And Joshua commented, this is, like we were saying in the interpretation video, long speeches from approved people, you can take them to the bank. So let's look at this story through that lens. And so what does Yahweh tell Abram? Leave the land you know, leave your family, and go where I will show you, again, by a God either unknown or distantly known to him, as far as we can tell. And so, let's focus here on the land and your family. So at that time, the land was your sustenance. Your family was your social support network. They didn't have urban living in it like we do. Towns did not exist in the way that we think of towns. We talked about that a little bit with Babel, that towns and urban living were often around temple complexes and worship. But the land that your family owned was very important to your identity and to your continued sustenance for yourself and your descendants. And there, actually, I should point out here, there's not an and in the text. I think that's important too, because it's not like there's a condition attached to this here. He's told to go, and he's also told, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Okay, so that's what comes in verse 2. So one of the things I want to point out here then is the parallelism. So I will make you a great nation, and I will make your name great. So these two things are sort of restatements. And then I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. So there's two statements about blessing. And then the blessing actually extends to, and through you all peoples will be blessed. So in Hebrew, what we're seeing here is something like what a literary device called synonymous parallelism. You see it all over the place in the Psalms. You can hardly get through a psalm without encountering at least one of these. Parallelism doesn't always take a synonymous form. Sometimes it can be antithetical. They can be opposites. Lord, remember me in your mercy and do not bring your wrath upon me. Something like that would be an opposite parallelism. It's trying to make the same point, but it's giving an opposite as opposed to giving the same a restatement of the exact same point. So this is used for emphasis. Now, if any of you at First Pres River Forest were present for my sermon on Isaiah 6, I talked a lot about repetition. Holy, holy, holy means look right here. This is important. Holiness is the point. Holiness is the attribute of God. Parallelism is another way that you see a lot of emphasis being offered to something. So varied repetition to get your attention. I have an example here. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. So we're seeing, the kinds of things that are trying to emphasize the point using different ways of stating it. Now, another thing I want to call out here. So bonus points. So this section right here, this middle one, I will make your name great and you will be a blessing, contrasts with another part earlier in Genesis. And so the question is, what story? What is this contrasting with? It's one we've been over. So you might be thinking of it right now. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Genesis 11:4. It's the Tower of Babel story. And so in chapter 11, so immediately before this, I don't think it's accidental, immediately before this, humanity, and we went over this in the Babel video, is trying to reestablish sacred space with God, reestablish the relationship with God their own way. And that way that they were using was actually the way of pagan worship. And God was having none of it. He came down that ziggurat and he wrecked it. Because that was, it was defiling to him to be worshipped in a false way like that. So this whole idea of making a name for ourselves, what's interesting is that God is not saying that some human or some part of humanity having a great name is a bad thing categorically, because that's what he's going to do to Abraham. He's going to give Abraham a great name. It's just God is saying, I'm going to choose how this is going to go. The great name is going to be given to Abram at this time. He's going to be given a mission. He's going to be the blessing upon all people. And so I just want to take a quick moment and say, I think if you read the story of the Tower of Babel in the way that we talked about, you see the continuity in the story. If it's just a story about how pride is bad and you should trust God, and then you move into the story of Abram, uh, Genesis gets broken up into these stories which we treat as vignettes that tell us something, moral about ourselves. And I don't deny that the moral dimension on some of these stories is there, but I don't want us to focus on the moral dimension to the exclusion of the arc, the narrative, the whole story. Like I've been insisting this whole time, the Bible is a story. It's one story. It's God's story. It's an autobiography in a way. And so let's try and read God's story as it's being told through the Bible. One other quick note, through you all peoples will be blessed. Not all persons. This is not every single person who has ever lived. I don't think it would be accurate to say that the Pharaoh of Egypt is a beneficiary of the Abrahamic blessing. This is, literally we're talking clans, families. The parallel I see, Revelation 5:9. So you, the Lamb, so Jesus purchased with your blood people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So not every person from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, but to all the nations. You're going to be a blessing to all kinds of people, all sorts of people. There will be no category of person that is excluded from the blessing. But I would argue here that this is not saying that through Abraham, every single person who ever lived is going to be a recipient of some kind of equal blessing. I think that gets us into some issues elsewhere. The Pharaoh of Egypt, I think, is a really good example. It doesn't seem like God's blessing him very much. Those plagues are pretty clear on that. So those are the things that God promises Abram. And Abram goes, and God further promises. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. He was 75 years old when he left Haran. So the land that he left on their way to Canaan, so they get up from there and they go. He's 75 years old. And then they, set out for the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, so this is going to happen once they're in Canaan, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your offspring. So let's not miss what's happening here. We want to notice what this would have meant to the 75-year-old childless Abram. He has no offspring at this point. So there's an explicit promise and an implicit promise. He's saying, I'm going to give this land to your offspring. The explicit one is there's land. But the one that really would have caught Abram's attention at this point is your offspring. I will make you into a great nation. Seem to imply that, but now it's also just spelled out. You will have offspring. You 75-year-old Abram, who've, as far as you're concerned, you lost the game because the woman that you ended up marrying couldn't have a child. From there, thinking it was all the woman's problem at that point too. So he just, picked a wife and it wasn't going to work out. And so his life was destined to really he was going to disappear into obscurity. But now he's being promised offspring in his old age. And he's being promised land. So just quick summary. God's promises now, you're going to see this again in 15 and 17. And so it's actually going to be spelled out even more explicitly as we get later into it. But Abram's going to be a great nation. There's going to be a blessing to Abram and all people, all tribe, tongue, people, and nations, and the land. And I want to start here for a second. A quick word about this land promise. This is really important to the Israelites and other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Land was livelihood. It's a promise of sustenance to you, security for offspring, and it's your identity. It's where you live. It's your house, in a sense. But the land was where you got your food. You grew off the land. You hunted on the land. It's where you got your water. You wanted land with living water. That was a spring. Bookmark that. Maybe I'll do a video on this at some point. When Jesus talks about living water, to people at that time, the phrase living water meant literally rushing water. And there's reasons why that's important there. But security for your offspring. So your inheritance, the land. If they didn't have land, then they didn't really have anything. They had to go and join with a family that did have land if they wanted to eat, if they wanted shelter, if they wanted water, if they wanted social support, if they wanted basically anything, you needed land. Uh, so without land, it's hard to think how it's possible that any of these promises actually would have happened. Um, so, we think of our new covenant, we think of forgiveness of sins, we think of the changing of the heart, we think of things that are happening on sort of a different plane of existence. They're happening inside of us. The Abrahamic covenant, the Sinai covenant, the Davidic covenant all had explicit material blessing attached to them. God is promising things that they can touch, that they will ingest, that they will live with, that they will see. This is, these are very, very concrete promises and very easy ways to say, is God actually following through on this or not? So it's something worth thinking about there, that there are material blessings associated with these covenants. So let's look at the covenant markers here. So who are the parties involved? God and Abram. Yes. And this is going to be very clear when we get in Genesis 17 too, and his offspring. So the land is promised, I will give this land to your offspring. And if we fast forward real quick to Genesis 17, I will keep my covenant between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant, to be your God and the God of your offspring after you, and to give you and your future offspring, and to you and your future offspring, I will give the land where you are residing, all the land of Canaan, as an eternal possession, and I will be their God. So not just there in chapter 12, but later, Abram's offspring, Abraham in that point, his offspring are explicitly named as parties of this covenant. What kind of oath is being taken? Again, if you want to go into this more, see the previous video on the covenants, the definition of a covenant, what these different kinds of oaths are. But in this case, it's a promissory oath. So only one party is making promises. All the promises are, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. I will bless. I will curse. There's no, and you will do this. Even though it says, go from your land, there's not a condition there. It's not, Abram, if you go from your land to Canaan, I will do this. He's, in some way, he's pre-promising the land. He's like, I'm going to show you this land, go there, and I'm going to give this to you. That's actually part of the promise. Now, if he wants to claim it, he's going to have to get up off his butt and go. But it's not a condition. It's not a condition. So one thing that got caught up in the animation here. So blessings and curses. Where do we see those? There's a blessing to Abraham and all tribe, tongue, people, and nations. And the curses, interestingly, only those who treat Abraham with contempt are cursed. So God is basically saying, I'm going to bless everybody through you, and those who treat you poorly, I'm going to come and protect you. I'm going to intervene on your behalf. This is super promissory right here, where it's not just a blessing, it's like a double blessing by cursing those who are against the party that is receiving the promise. And how will it come to an end? There's really not any indication that the covenant comes to an end. Even though Abraham will eventually die, he's not the only one who's a party to the covenant. His offspring are. And as we're definitely going to see in chapter 15, his offspring will carry on, number the, it will be like the number of the stars in the sky, countless. And so if they are all parties to this covenant, then, and God's not going to die, then you don't see how the covenant is ever going to end via the grave, by the lifelong part of the covenant being terminated. And since God's the only one making the promises, and God is all powerful and all good and cannot lie and will always keep his promises, then you're never going to see failure to fulfill the promises to be the reason why the covenant's not carried out. So this covenant is, deductively at that point, it's going to be there forever. So the whole arrangement is not truly a covenant until the ratification in chapter 15. So basically we've read the stipulations, but chapter 15, now if you want to turn there, so this is where you're going to see the ratification ceremony. Those of you who listened to the sermon this morning from Pastor Paul, anyone who wants to look it up, it's the sermon on October 8th, 2017, First Presbyterian Church of River Forest in River Forest, Illinois, firstpressrf.org. I think so. Yep. He did a terrific job going over chapter 15. I highly recommend Pastor Paul's sermon from this morning. One thing I want to point out as we get into this ratification ritual, again, if you want the context on that, go to the previous video. A covenant relationship like this between God and humanity is unparalleled in the ancient Near Eastern literature and history. You don't see this. You see covenants, you see relationships with God, but the way that God and humans related to each other was, sort of like we talked about with Babel. You had a temple, and you offered things to the god in the temple. You offered food in the form of sacrifices, clothing. Gods needed shelter in temples. You had the ziggurats, so that God could come down to the temple that you built and get the sacrifices. That was the way they thought of it. The idea that there's going to be a covenant like this between humanity and God does not appear anywhere. God might do things for you, but it was retributive. If you fed the god, then the god would protect you against either the chaos or the other gods of the other states that were fighting your god and causing, a variation of the vegetative cycle. So if your god wasn't getting the food that sustained your god, then the vegetative cycle might be disrupted. And you really needed to get on that and give the god the food that was necessary to fight back. That's not anything like the promises in Genesis. It's not anything like the explicit ratification ritual we're about to see. Like I said, it's absurd. It's as absurd to the ancients as if we said we had some kind of a constitution with God. It's meaningless. But this is what happened, and this is really different. So chapter 15, so reading 1 through 8. So after these events, the word of the Lord came to Abram with a vision. In a vision, don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. But Abram said, Lord God, what can you give me since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Abram continued, look, you've given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house will be my heir. Now the word of the Lord came to him. This one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, your offspring will be that numerous. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, Lord God, how can I know I will possess it? The word of the Lord. Okay, so let's recap quickly. So God says, hey, Abram, don't be afraid. Your reward's going to be great. And Abram says, so about that, when's this whole offspring thing going to start? I ain't getting any younger over here. A slave born in my house will be my heir. So just some context there in the ancient Near East. So if you didn't have a descendant, sometimes elderly people with an estate but no descendants would adopt an adult to take care of them in their old age in exchange for passing on the estate to that adopted adult when they died. And Abram seems to think that's what's going to become of him. So this was maybe a way that a slave, for instance, because there's probably not going to be another adult in his clan, that person will probably have married and will have their own children. I suppose it could be, but a slave in the house was seeming to be the way that Abram thinks this is going to go, that the slave is going to end up inheriting the estate. And God says, so not only will you have an heir, but your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. I'm Yahweh after all, and I brought you out from your land to this land that I promised you. Quick note here, the way that it's phrased, so I am Yahweh who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans, so that's a land, to give you this land to possess. Sounds very similar to the beginning of another covenant ceremony. The first commandment, beginning of the first commandment, I am the Lord your God who brought you out from Egypt from the house of bondage, Exodus 22. So there's kind of a sort of an allusion to the Exodus, or I'm sorry, that's backwards. There's an allusion in Exodus to this particular moment. But at any rate, Abram says, how do I know this will happen? Fine question. So let's break a few of these things down. Let's break down the divine name, actually. In verse 7, I don't know if you caught it. I used the Holman translation to emphasize this because they translate the divine name quite often in its proper noun form. Rather than Lord in capital letters, they will say Yahweh. Not always, but whenever it seems to be used as a personal name. So, I am Yahweh. So we're familiar with the story from Exodus 3:14. So Moses at the burning bush, saying, who can I tell the people sent me? And he says, tell them that I am sent you. I am who I am. So YHWH, the Hebrew letters that begin each word of the divine name. I am who I am. That's where you get Yahweh. It's the pronunciation of the YHWH. And so when you look at the self-identification of God in the Abrahamic narrative, I think this is interesting. Commentators have a field day with divine names in Genesis. If you really want to see some scholarly navel-gazing, you can look at people who write these long treatises about divine names in Genesis. But I think this is important. So in Genesis 12, God does not refer to himself with any name. It's just I. And in Genesis 15, at the covenant ratification, he's giving himself a unique name. He's referring to himself by the divine name, Yahweh. That is, I am Yahweh. It's not like the text. This isn't the narrator. This is from the mouth of God. I am Yahweh who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans. And so now this God among gods in Genesis 12, which Abram really didn't have much problem with, this God among gods now has named himself Yahweh. So this is who I am. And then in Genesis 17, he refers to himself El Shaddai as God Almighty, putting himself above other gods. I am the Almighty. I am far more than anything else. I am the most important. So you see, as the stages of the covenant are progressing, God is getting more specific and revealing more about himself. So if you go back to the previous video on the definition of covenant, we covered some theological questions. And the question is, why use covenant at all? And it seemed like, at least the answer that I find compelling is God is meeting people using, God intends communication. God is using the idiom of the people to communicate with them because you need common context in order to communicate. And so this is part of the revelation of this God. And if God had just given blessing broadly to everybody, just willy-nilly, they would have been apt to treat that as either reciprocity for the sacrifices that they were giving to their local gods, in which case they're not noticing Yahweh's uniqueness. And so what's happening here is Yahweh is revealing himself progressively to Abraham by making these promises, by making the circumstances even more fantastic and even more unbelievable, and then delivering. And so that's part of the importance of this development. And this is for the record, this is my reading of this particular text. I find this particular observation compelling. I think others, reasonable people could disagree on this, but I find this to be a really interesting sequence here. It goes from just one of the other gods to a unique God with a name to the Almighty as the promises are progressing. So the ratification ritual, so we talked about this also in the covenants video. So there's no new promises now. So this is going to begin in verse 9 and go through 21. So this is, bring me a 3-year-old cow and a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abram brought these to Yahweh, split them down the middle, laid the pieces opposite each other, did not cut up the birds. Side note, text doesn't say this, but oftentimes the birds weren't cut. Their heads were pinched off. Gory, but it's what we know. The birds of prey came on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and a great terror and darkness descended on him. So the animals here, this is the covenant ceremony. So we talked about this in the covenant video, that there was animal sacrifice during covenant ratification, and the parts were split, and the party or parties that would take an oath would walk through the parts, and the symbolism was if we violate our oath, let what has happened to these animals happen to us. So this is deadly serious. But see, only God has made any promises here. We talked about that. All the promises are promises made by God. And when you look at verse 17, God is the one that passes through. So God is swearing by his own necessary existence that these things are going to happen. If you give me just 1 second here. Right. So let's talk about the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch. So the Shekinah glory, the glory of God. So Isaiah 6, smoke filled the temple. Smoke was in the temple, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Exodus 19, so you've got the cloud on the mountain. Exodus 40, the cloud descending on the tabernacle after that's built. And it's a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Again, this was a point I made in my sermon on Isaiah 6. Whenever you see smoke, whenever you see fire, the big cloud descended on Solomon's temple as well, presence of God. Think presence of God. The fiery smoke, the dramatic presence of God called the Shekinah glory. That's a marker of the presence of God. And you see tongues of fire at Pentecost as well when the Holy Spirit descends. So in verse 17, so when the sun had set, I know I skipped something, I'll get back to it, but it was dark, and a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. So this is the smoking fire pot. So you have fire, you have smoke, you have flame. This is sort of the first time you see this manifestation, this metaphysical manifestation of God, that you then see the burning bush. You see it at Sinai, you see it at the tabernacle, you see it at Solomon's temple, you see it in Isaiah's theophany, you see the transfiguration, you see a form of it at Pentecost. So this manifest presence of God passes through the divided animals in covenant ratification. So God is using the idioms that Abram is familiar with. He would have been familiar with these implements, quite likely, text doesn't say, but quite likely, these same kind of implements, a fire pot, a torch, were used in ceremonies for sun gods and fire gods in ancient Near Eastern religion. That's what he grew up in. So even Abram would have been able to make a connection that these things are associated with the God. Now, to see them, I don't know how they go. Are they on the ground? Are they floating? Who knows? But to see them like this cloud, this fire cloud going through these parts, probably didn't look anything like what he saw growing up, but he would have understood. God is using the most solemn and the most the most serious form of agreement making, the covenant that Abram's familiar with, using imagery that he understands to be God, to communicate to Abram, who's like, how do I know that I'm actually going to get these things that you're saying? He says, I'm going to use the most intense form of communication, swearing by my existence that this will happen. So it's really incredible. And now this helps make sense of, so what's with this floating pot and torch going between divided animals? What the heck is going on here? That's what's going on here. It's the covenant ratification ritual, and it's the dramatic presence of God saying, if I do not follow through on these promises, let what has happened to these animals happen to the immortal, invincible, almighty which just by definition cannot happen. So it is necessary. He's saying this promise is more certain than the sun coming up tomorrow, basically. So the other thing he finds out, though, is going to be hard. The bondage in Egypt is foretold. Just a quick thing, too. Bondage, if you hear that term biblically, so the bondage is describing Egypt, the exile is describing Babylon. Just so there's no confusion, those terms have been kind of, or slavery is also used to describe Egypt. They could be interchangeable, but if you just throw around the word exile in biblical studies circles, they're going to think you refer to Babylon. If you throw around slavery or bondage, they'll think you're thinking of Egypt. The iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So that's towards the end there. I will judge the nation that they serve. Well, let me back up. The Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be foreigners in the land that does not belong to them. They will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. In the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So what do you make of that? My suggestion here, so read Isaiah 10 as sort of a parallel. God uses the nations to punish other nations. He has other purposes that are only alluded to within the scripture. He's got a plan for the Amorites, all right. He's got a plan for everything. Isaiah 10, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and in whose hand is the staff of my indignation. God is talking about using using nations to rise up, and so in this case Assyria is being used as the rod of his anger. And then he also talks about how he's going to punish Assyria for the haughtiness of their hearts and their pride. Does the axe boast over the one who wields it? But there's a whole lot that God has planned out, and the Amorites are not yet at the point where they have sort of earned the judgment that's coming upon them, it seems. And then verse 18, so on this day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I will give this land to your offspring. So the covenant is made. The land is part of it. The offspring are part of it. That's all been ratified now. Then if you want to turn to Genesis 17, you have the sign of the covenant. So we talked about the sign, circumcision for the Abrahamic covenant. But let's look at how this begins. So in verse 1, I am God Almighty. I am El Shaddai. So we talked about this a little bit. The God above other gods. Yahweh is putting himself as supreme. So he went from one amongst gods to having a unique name to being the Almighty. He doubles down in another promise. You'll be a father of many nations. He renames Abraham. And so the renaming is, so one thing, it introduces a specific named party to this covenant, Abraham. But why rename? So we saw naming in Genesis 1 and 2 is a creative act that sort of gives vocation or gives a role to something, gives function to something. So naming was extraordinarily important in the ancient Near East. It still is today. But Abram, so the meaning of the name Abram, great father, which is ironic, right? He's the great father. He's 99 years old at this point in 17:1, still doesn't have a kid. So he's a laughingstock. You gotta wonder how often this guy got made fun of for it. I cannot imagine that this was not something that didn't come up all the time, at least in his own head, if not others saying the same thing. But he goes from the great father with no children to the father of many, or the father of nations would be another way to look at this one. So he is renamed the father of many, or the father of nations, for I will make you the father of many nations. So maybe it's maybe many nations is the best way to read it. So that's the meaning of the new name that he's given. And then 17:7, I will keep my covenant between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations. So the offspring, if there's any question right now, are the offspring part of the covenant? The answer is yes, they are. The land is promised. So if you look further Uh, verse 8, and to you and your future offspring I will give the land where you are residing, all the land of Canaan, as an eternal possession, and I will be their God. So, I will be their God, singular. Again, like this kind of observation is only going to make sense in the backdrop of Abram's background in the polytheistic sort of pagan ancient Near East. But he's saying, I am going to be their God, capital G, the God Almighty, me, Yahweh, who has done these things for you. You can take it to the bank. My promises are real. I am doing these miraculous things. I'm telling you the thing I'm going to do. You're not like asking for something and then I'm responding. I'm calling my shot and then I'm doing it. And I'm doing things that you think are impossible. In, chapter 17, God is, Abram just outright doesn't believe this promise. Can a child be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, give birth? And so, this is, I should say one thing. When I say he still doesn't have a son, because I said that earlier. Ishmael is born at this point. Isaac is not, but Ishmael is born. So Sarah still doesn't have a son. He does not have a son by his wife yet. So this is just seeming more and more fantastic. Like it's just simply not possible. So God's setting up these conditions, calling his shot. He says, I'm going to do it, and he does deliver. The one other allusion I wanted to say real quick, there's a bit of an allusion to when Yahweh says, I will be their God. Leviticus 26:12, the tripartite promise. I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier videos too. But I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people. This is a promise. I will be their God is part of the reestablishment of the relationship that God and humans had pre-fall. Now, quick thing on circumcision. So why circumcision? Like of all the signs that you could come up with, why circumcision? So circumcision's not exclusively an Israelite practice. I know they're not Israelites yet, so forgive me here. But this was seen primarily in as part of this covenant. There is evidence in Egypt, ancient evidence in Egypt for the practice of circumcision. It's a rite of passage, symbolic coming of age. This was done either prepubescent or prenuptial, but it was about a new identity. It was going into a new stage in life. And so the circumcision at the time, again, this is speaking in the idiom that they understood at the time, and that made sense, and this had symbolic meaning to them that it doesn't to us today. But if we get in the idea and the mentality of that culture, we can understand why something like circumcision would have made sense, that we are now entering into a new relationship. We did a covenant ritual. Again, covenants established new relationships. It is a new stage in the relationship. It's not confirming what's already there. Circumcision was the same thing. You were coming into a new identity. And so it makes sense that circumcision would be a sign of the covenant to Abraham and his offspring at this point. One other just a question that would matter to us today. So why do men only men get the covenant sign? Were women not part of the covenant? Were they not cared about? Again, let's get in the mentality of that day. The culture at that time identified with the clan and the family, and the patriarch represented corporately the whole clan. That's just how it worked. That's how they understood their identity. This isn't an idea that's being imposed on them from the outside. This is how culturally they derived their own identity. If you'd asked a man, if you'd asked a woman at the time, like where did they belong? Just like we say we're citizens of the United States, for instance, or whatever country we're from. They were part of the household. And so the covenant sign, their whole household was covered by the covenant sign within the patriarchs. And so, the sons would then eventually be the patriarchs of their clans, as they had children, their children married, and had their children and split off into their portion of land. So that's why the males were, of later generations were circumcised. Often, by the way, especially in Egypt, They were circumcised later, you know, obviously with if it's either prepubescent or prenuptial. Um, and so that's just how this was understood back then. So there's not anything here trying to talk about the difference between the status of men and women in the covenant. Um, it was something again that's culturally relevant to how they understood their own identity at that time. So why does any of this all matter? What have we just talked about for this whole period of time? Well, what I want to do just real quick is to go through the narrative that's been established so far. So in Genesis 1 and 2, God and humanity was in right relationship. Humans were working out their vocation. They're God's image bearers. They're the administrators on his behalf. They're to rule and subdue in his good creation. They're the royal priests. Genesis 3, humanity's rebellion caused a loss of that relationship. Sin mars our ability to be what we're made to be, and so we leave. We can no longer be close to the holy. But God promises, crushing the head of the serpent and all, this is eventually going to be overcome. This will be restored. And so now we're starting to see iterations on that kind of restoration. So Genesis 6, God is angered by human sin. So human sin is the thing that separated us in the first place. So God's angered by that sin, wipes out the evildoers. Noah, you're cool. You get to stay. You and your family will put you over here. You're righteous. Everyone else gone. But it doesn't solve the problem. Genesis 8:21, the more I read this, the more I find that verse to be incredibly important and really interesting. That even though the project was take the righteous, preserve the righteous, wipe out the evildoers, and start over and recommission, rule and subdue, all the creatures will have the terror of you in them, be fruitful, multiply. So the same charge is to Adam. He says, yet post-flood, so he's talking about Noah and his descendants, the heart of man is still inclined to evil all the time. So annihilation didn't solve the problem, and God is not going to resort to annihilation to solve the problem. It just won't work. That's not how, just getting rid of all the bad guys is not the way that this relationship will be restored. Genesis 11, humanity gives it a try. We try and reestablish the relationship on our own using false pagan forms of worship, and God's having none of that. God defies the overture, comes down, scatters everybody, confuses the language, and then in Genesis 12, rather than humanity making its name great on its own, he said, I'm going to take the lowly son of a pagan family who, with an ironic name, who's, has no children, and I will promise to work a miracle through him. I'm going to give him offspring, land, and a blessing to all tribes, tongues, people, and nations. The Abrahamic project goes all the way to Revelation. And then God follows through on the promises. Abraham does get the promised son. That son does then become the father. Isaac becomes, the father of Jacob. Jacob, Israel, the one who wrestles with God. The father of the 12. And from that line comes Jesus, the blessing to the world. So this whole story is part of the way that God, the drama of redemption that God is using to bring us back into relationship with him. So that's kind of the progression here. And that's all for now. So thanks for watching. Next week is going to be on the Sinai Covenant. And appreciate your time. Thank you.